I want to start this talk with the kind of customary disclaimer. This is work in progress. I'm just really working my way through and trying to navigate the kind of intricacies that of some of the arguments that I'm making today, and about US politics. I mean, as Karen was saying, I feel like I'm a little bit of an imposter here because I did train in the UK and I teach in New Zealand. In fact, I was born in Italy, and I'm talking about your country. So I'm sure that you can help me with that. So I want to start with a quote, really, and a question that Democratic Representative Caroline Maloney asked in February 2012 after the Republican chairman for a congressional hearing on religious liberty and birth control refused to allow law student Sandra Fluke to testify. And she said, And she said, I look at this panel and I don't see one single individual representing the tens of millions of women across the country who want and need insurance coverage for preventative healthcare services, including family planning. Where are the women? And this is the panel that she was looking at. And as you can see, the women are in the audience, not in the panel. So there are many interesting things about this quote, but one of the ones that interested me the most was that Twitter actually picked up this quote very, very, very quickly and put it through many tweets with the hashtag "Where are the women," which consequently became a catch-all term to indicate the absence of women from public life, and started a trend that really is still persisting today. So, for instance, earlier this month, Minority Leader of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, used it in response to a picture tweeted by the Republican Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, portraying 8 male Republicans sitting around the table ready to negotiate around the government shutdown. So, where are the women is a question that has resonance both in the online and the offline world. So, and this is where I want to start today. I want to ask, where are the women? Why are they not allowed to speak on behalf of other women when it comes to women's issues and concerns? And this was a question that was particularly interesting during the 2012 US presidential election, and hence my interest in it. And in many ways that election was very unusual, especially for gender politics. It saw the highest number of female candidates running and winning representative and Senate seats. There were 166 women winning representative seats, 118 Democrats and 48 Republicans, and 18 women winning Senate seats, 12 Democrats and 6 Republicans. Women also made up the majority of voters, 53%, and decided the outcome of the election. So Obama actually won against Romney by a 10-point gender gap. So 55% of women actually voted for Obama, and there were especially Latinas and African Americans, but also white women, against 45% of men who voted for Obama. And this was the second highest gender gap since 1980, actually. The higher one was higher by 1%, so 1 point. And it was 1996 when Bill Clinton won against Bob Dole. Also, gender-specific issues and policies such as abortion, rape, and birth control became priorities for women, especially in swing states, which is very important and unusual. And male candidates who were seen to take an especially controversial stance on gender-specific issues actually lost their seats. So Todd Akin, Missouri, and Richard Murdoch. Is this how you pronounce it, Murdoch? Yeah. In Indiana. Okay. So these were the kind of unusual things about this election. There were a lot of very typical, actually, things that happened, classic things that happened during this election. So despite the fact that women make up the majority of the US population at the moment, 50.10% of the American population is women, and despite the record numbers of women elected for office, only 18.1% of Congress members are women. There is a very nice infographic here. If you look at the middle part, 17.7% of women are in the House of Representatives, and 20% of the Senate are women. And actually the percentages are even lower when it comes to mayors of the largest US cities. Only 12% of mayors are women and 10% even lower governors. So these were the really unusual aspects about the last election, the typical one. And these unsurprising aspects of the election were exacerbated in the media, and especially the old media. So we know that women are traditionally underrepresented in the expert discussion, and expert discussion in general, but especially of politics and political matters. This is what normally happens in elections. But in this last election, 2012, women were underrepresented when it came to expert discussion, not only of politics, but actually of women's issues. So here's a nice infographic again. Men were 4 to 7 times more likely to be cited by the press, printed media, and television and radio than 5 to 7 times. Now, of course, there's the question: are women's issues political issues? So, where were the women in the 2012 election? They were clearly not offline. They were not in the papers, or at least not very much. They were not on television. They were not very much in politics. Were they online? Did they use online media to talk about women's issues? And if so, what did they have to say? And how do we evaluate what they had to say in terms of its democratic value? We actually know remarkably little about political women in online media. There are a few exceptions, but we actually know very little about them. We also don't know what kind of politics women discuss online. We know that women are less likely to discuss politics, big P, of the institutions, the politics of the institutions online. But do they talk about gender politics? Do they talk about identity politics? Do they talk about reproductive politics? Do they talk about small p politics? So, in other words, I'm asking, is it actually possible that the underrepresentation of women's voices in offline media actually reflected reality? In other words, that men are more interested and therefore more likely to talk about women's interests more than women, and therefore being asked for their opinion. Or actually, is it rather the opposite, that actually it was just a case of discrimination? And so I'm asking, did digital media actually give women officials a channel through which to discuss women's issues that traditional media denied them? So I'm looking at whether women's issues, values and concerns were discussed on Twitter by these women. And before I continue, I just want to kind of clarify what I mean by women's issues. It's a fairly controversial subject, and I can't address it in too much detail, but I'd be happy to talk about it later in the questions, perhaps. But the way in which I'm using this kind of term, women's issues, it's rather loosely. It's kind of, I'm using it as an umbrella term that groups issues of reproductive politics, which was so prevalent in the 2012 campaign, but also issues of equality of opportunity and equal representation. So when I talk about women's issues, I go from abortion and birth control to rape, from education to welfare. In other words, when I talk about women's issues, I talk about the policy areas that we know women favour compared to men, and we have statistics about that. So the thesis that I want to advance in this paper is that when women officials discuss women's issues as part of their political campaign, they're gendering political communication. Gendering political communication means making gender a key aspect rather than an exception of the campaign. It means making political institutions, political discourse, and policy-making practices more relevant to the values and perspectives of women. So in order to find out whether these women officials gendered political communication through Twitter, during this election I analysed their online Twitter presence. I looked at the content and style of their tweets to find out whether they brought different values and priorities to their online political communication. And I was particularly interested in how these values and priorities were present in their political discourse in relation to two key areas: policy making and political institutions. And the argument is that when policy-making practices and political institutions are made more relevant to women, political discourse becomes feminized and political communication gendered. Now, I see eyes rolling here, so I'm just going to define very quickly what I mean by feminized political discourse as opposed to gendered political communication. So political debate, like politics and political institutions, operate on the basis of masculine norms, which are both stylistic and structural. So when we think about, for instance, political debate, we think about aggressive, hostile, negative campaigning. So feminizing political discourse means challenging these norms and redefining what counts as political debate. In particular, feminizing political discourse involves explicitly making women the subject of political discourse, rather than treating them as second-class citizens, whether implicitly or explicitly. So this is what feminizing political discourse is. So the gendering of political communication derives from this feminization of political discourse. So when political discourse is feminized, by recalibrating the focus of politics from an implicitly male enterprise to an activity that both women and men perform equally, then political communication is gendered because it treats men and women as equals. So what role does social media, and in particular Twitter, that's what I'm focusing on, playing in gender and campaign themes? Let me say a couple of things about social media and politics first. As we all know, social media have recently become these kind of measures of political success. Okay, so we hear about, we heard about the Egypt Facebook revolution, which kind of was used as a synonym of the triumph of democracy over dictatorship, in particular of the Mubarak regime. And then we heard of, we're familiar with the term Twitter revolution, which was used to indicate how ordinary people have been empowered to break news and hold traditional power structures to account, for example, during the Arab Spring. But we also know that social media is seen as one of the platforms where political elections are fought. So politics is often referred to as politics 2.0, establishing networks of volunteers and raise money through donations, which is basically what Obama did. So I quite like this as the picture on the left. It's one of the infographics that was around at the time of the last election. What it's looking at is Obama's and Romney's online presence, and it kind of is alleging that online media could explain Obama's electoral victory. And on the other side, we have the meme of the binders full of women comment, and the picture underneath is the picture that was tweeted when it was clear that Obama had won re-election. And I'll talk a little bit about it in a bit. But I do want to make 2 points about what I've just said. One is that the literature tells us very little about women politicians' use of social media. So we know a lot about how Obama, and before him McCain, and before him many other men have used online campaigns. But we know very little, for instance, about how Clinton ran her campaign online. And the second point is that by emphasizing the importance of the individual politician over the party, social media are seen as facilitating the process of personalization of politics, which in turn leads to a sense that politicians are more authentic on these platforms, compared, for instance, to television political advertising. And this has consequences for the feminization of political discourse, which I'll come to a bit later. So what I did was I collected data from 26 Twitter accounts, which amount to more or less 15% of the total women officials who actually got re-elected or were elected for the first time. So only people who were elected are in my sample. And I'm in the process of analysing this data. And the data that I'm presenting today is actually a small pilot for the larger coding project. And I have oversampled for Republican officials because it became very clear to me that their presence in my sample would really complicate this idea of what women's interests are. So, what I'm doing with this data, I'm asking to what extent can we argue that Twitter provided a space to discuss gender-specific issues and topics by creating new communicative and political spaces. And so in order to answer this question, I looked at discussions around policy-making practices and political institutions. And I just want to start with discussions around policy. So the literature tells us that making policy more relevant to women means promoting women's rights and bringing women's interests and concerns to the forefront of politics, which is a traditional male domain. So I was saying, defining what women's interests are is a notoriously controversial matter, and the key problem here is that to define an issue as a woman-specific one means to establish a hierarchy of issues. Okay, so on the one hand, there are the foreign policy, international relations, and economy issues. There are the kind of, war and peace and trade. These are the masculine kind of important power politics issues. And then there are the so-called domestic issues. Okay, and the domestic issues are health, education, welfare, which are the feminine and kind of soft policy areas that seem as in comparison to the floor barrier for women seeking public office, that can be seen as a double bind. If we don't make changes to strengthen entitlement programs now, they won't be there for future generations. They also advocated changing these policy areas by mobilizing voters around their rights. So Mitt Romney wants to get rid of Planned Parenthood. I say let's get rid of politicians who flip-flop on women's health to run for high office. So in this sense, the hierarchy of concerns that is born out of masculine norms of what politics is and what it should include is minimized. The points that these women are making is that these are important concerns that we should all rally around rather than just women, in the name of future generations and against unaccountable politicians. So the point is, we don't need to fight against women, but we do need to fight against injustice. So what's interesting to notice here is what happens when women's issues are actually depoliticized. So for instance, in February 2012, after all health services were required to provide birth control options to women, conservative groups called the Health and Human Service birth control mandate unconstitutional. And so a Republican senator tweeted, "This is not a women's rights issue, it's a religious liberty issue." What this tweet does, it shifts the attention from women's rights to a traditionally male domain, religion, and its administrators. In this way, it creates the gender split between what is important and what's not, i.e. women's rights, and who should be allowed to speak about it, i.e. religious gatekeepers. So even if my sample of women officials were more likely to talk about policy-making practices that are more sensitive to women's interests and concerns on their Twitter feeds, they were also likely to depoliticize these issues by shifting responsibility to traditional gatekeepers. So next I want to consider how Twitter facilitated discussions around political institutions. So what we know about political institutions is that they become much more relevant to women when there are women physically representing other women. And this is because by representing other women, this is political theory tells us that by representing other women, women can bring different values, concerns and priorities to the activities of government and make a difference in how policy concerns are defined, policy priorities established and equality achieved. So candidates in the 2012 election spoke on behalf of other women and their concerns as marginalized groups. So for instance, when in August 2012, Todd Akin stated during an interview about abortion that legitimate rape does not result in pregnancy, one response to that was this: Aiking's comments are totally offensive. I agree with John Cornyn for cutting off funding. Aiking should step aside now. So by taking on the concerns of the women, his rights have been marginalised by Aiking. This official aims to substantively represent other women by acting on their behalf as a disadvantaged group. The politicians in the sample aimed at representing other women symbolically by standing for higher principles such as honesty and accountability that challenged the androcentrism of traditional politics. For instance, can you pass along my policy plans to your friends and family? Voters want substance, not negative ads. So by rejecting negative advertising as campaigning tools, which are a method traditionally employed by male politicians, this senator is standing for the notion that she as a woman can change political practices. So now an interesting but provisional result shows that party affiliation plays a key part in the ways in which women running for office represent other women. In other words, political representation is articulated according to different criteria depending on the concern. So, for instance, when it comes to advocating equality, Democratic women are perhaps unsurprisingly likely to be more inclusive than Republican women. So, for instance, marriage equality and equality for marginalized groups, such as the LGBT community, are concerns that Democratic women overall seem more likely to support. So, for instance, thanks, Assemblyman Daniel J. O'Donnell, author of New York Marriage Equality, California Assembly Speaker Perez, and all my LGBT friends for supporting me tonight. So equality, opportunity, and parity are at the core of this tweet. Symbolically representing her constituency for this representative means fighting against discrimination, independently from whom this discrimination is directed against. It doesn't matter that it's not women or just women. On the other side of the spectrum, Republican officials express their representative role in descriptive terms. They represent other women because of their gender. This is where ideology becomes once again a core factor in this definition. Women, for these officials, occupy traditional gender roles. They're mothers, they're wives, they're educators. And here are some examples of how Republican officials address their female constituency. This is one. Kelly helped her husband launch his family landscaping and snow removal company. Yes, she's good with the snowplow, says this senator in surprise. And the other one is, today we announce educators for Fisher, honored to have the support of Nebraska teachers, administrators, and parents, and this was the picture that went with it. So the subjects of these tweets are women who help educate, raise, and support their families and the men in their lives. They don't seem to exist in their own right. Their concerns are different from the ones of the previous example. Equality or parity of opportunity, at least in theory, does not seem to be a priority for the women that these officials are serving and representing. What seems to be more important is maintaining existing social structures. So while the LGBT example gendered the debate because it readdressed this imbalance of power, the Republican example perpetuates the idea that governance is split along gender lines and relegates women to the private sphere by not according them independent existence from their male counterpart. So the women in this example are not treated as a political concern. In fact, they exist in a space that's separate from the realm of politics altogether. Okay, so let me just move on now to political discourse. So when officials make policy-making practices and political institutions more relevant to women, they feminize political discourse. In other words, they bring women to the forefront of the policy agenda, and in so doing, they make themselves symbolically represent other women. And so here I want to consider whether the women in my sample challenged masculine norms of political debate and therefore feminize the political discourse. So the literature indicates that women tend to use a communicative style that rejects conflict and confrontation in favour of collaboration and care. This is somewhat consistent with my own provisional findings. For instance, official expressed a sense of shared solidarity towards women's professional achievements, like in this tweet. Modified tweet, US Olympic, incredible showing by Team USA, women's second day, first gold in women's boxing, first gold in women's water polo, gold in women's soccer. And another example, tonight I'm honored to join Senator Barb Mikulski and colleagues to celebrate her remarkable tenure as the longest serving woman in Congress. They also express pride in belonging to a particular group. Nobody's asking where are the women in Floater Square today. I was proud to join hundreds, rally for women. And they use intimacy that takes the form of these kind of private messages, which of course are not private because they're on Twitter. Thoughts are with Marco Rubio and family, prayers for Amanda Swift and for recovery. So these symbolic choices indicate that the officials in my sample challenged masculine norms of political debate, at least to an extent. Although not all the candidates engaged with women's issues, priorities and concerns, or didn't do so in a way that advanced gender equality, Twitter seemed to provide a safe, controllable political campaign space in which they had the power to define the conversation, I'm using inverted commas here, by directly addressing a large pool of voters and bypassing traditional news cycles. They were also able to communicate with their constituents in less filtered and more personalised ways. So by personalising the campaign, which I'm going back to what I was saying at the beginning, so by personalising the campaign, that is by including personal, intimate details and imagery of personal life and achievements, they aimed at making their politics more relevant to other women and appear more authentic. So by way of concluding here, I want to just go back to my original questions. And there were, where are the women? Are they in line, and are they speaking on behalf of other women about their issues and concerns? So during the 2012 presidential campaign, a number of women politicians were speaking about and on behalf of other women in social media, were bringing women's issues to the forefront of policymaking practices, and were representing women's concerns and values. However, not all of these women contributed to the feminization of politics by challenging masculine norms of political debate, by advancing the status of women in society, and by redefining what counts as political concern by virtue of being a woman. It would be reductive to assume that gender and technology determine the communicative style or content of political discourse. Gendered political communication is not intrinsic to the technological tools used to communicate a political message. So Twitter seemed to create a new communicative space able to bypass traditional gatekeepers that allowed for gendered communication. But this doesn't mean that all women use Twitter to give a voice to the traditional voiceless. Moreover, traditional gatekeepers, yes, perhaps are being bypassed, but actually new gatekeepers are emerging through these online platforms. For instance, PR and media teams keep a tight control of what is said where, including online. So, we think about the picture that we saw before, Team Obama, that very carefully crafted sound bites and the photo opportunities. The soundbite is 4 more years, and this apparently was the most retweeted picture in the history of Twitter. And presumably, we don't know, but presumably she was advised to do so if she was considering running in 2016. But nor is gendered political communication biologically determined. There are no stylistic conventions that are typically feminine or the result of the social role traditionally occupied by women as guardian mothers, caregivers, and homemakers. Instead, my analysis indicates that partisanship and ideology play a key role in establishing the direction of online communication, in relation to the role that women should occupy in society, and in determining who speaks for whom and for what purpose. So officials who feminize the debate by supporting other women and their professional achievements and utilizing a personalized style of communication gender the debate by redefining what counts as political concern and promoting equality. On the other hand, officials who use traditional masculine categories and norms of style and content of political communication didn't challenge the status quo. For instance, a number of officials in my sample use self-promotion. I didn't use any examples here because of time, but a number of officials use self-promotion to generate a belief that one is, this is taken from the literature, to generate the belief what self-promotion is, generates the belief that one is personally responsible for causing the government to do something that the audience considers desirable. So a number of these officials use self-promotion to do this. And you know, I can only imagine that female politicians seem to be more conscious than their male counterpart that the importance of promoting their own competences and achievements. They need to promote their own competences and achievements because nobody else is going to do it for them. However, this type of communicative style perpetuates masculine ideas of leadership and what it means to be a leader and what it takes. The adoption of this style is not accidental. Lewandowski argues that women officials are placed under enormous pressure to conform to a white, male, and middle-class template. This is a script that has been developed during centuries of white, male, and middle-class institutions, where women existed merely as cleaners, caretakers, and wives, rather than officials. And this is where the tension between the need to conform and the pressure to change long-held traditions is most marked. The rhetorical use of themes such as family, children, and mothers preserve and promote traditional gender roles and norms, which do not advance the role of women in politics and contribute to their further marginalization in politics. And this is, of course, problematic because gender in political communication means bringing women's issues to the forefront of the campaign and making them election issues. And making gendered issues election issues means setting the policy agenda in ways that take into consideration women's values, priorities, and concerns, and that will advance the role of women in politics. And I'll leave it to this. Thank you very much. Thank you.